when the song came during the offering and everybody was there with the ukuleles, I guess those are, right? That made me smile. So thank you to the Hardenico family. I'm not sure if I put the accent right on that, but thank you for your participation today. So I would like to start into the message for today with a question. I'm just wondering if you might have the same experience as I do. Have you ever noticed that there are different ways to encounter the Bible? And I say the word encounter because you can read it, you can see a dramatization of it, you can listen to an audio presentation of it. As a matter of fact, sometimes you can even read it in a different language. I don't know about you, but when I do that, I find that each different medium gives me a little bit of different insight into it. And I can read a little bit of Spanish and a little bit of Greek, so it forces me to slow down. But at the same time, we don't have to read other languages to realize that the different ways of listening gives us different ideas. So I've been listening more to the New Testament, and I'm going to explain why. You may remember that I said last week, earlier this month, I met together with Pastor Henao and the elders, and I suggested to them that we focus on the teachings of Jesus, right? I suggested that we focus on the teaching of Jesus for the first few months of the year, for the reason that we call ourselves disciples of Jesus, right? We believe in him as Messiah and Lord. And as I said last week, the New Testament asserts, makes it clear that Jesus is the highest and best revelation of God and of God's will. He's the consummate teacher. So with all of that in mind, since we're going to be spending the next few months looking at the teachings of Jesus, I decided that I should increase my exposure to his teachings, even while I'm walking. So I've been wearing the earbuds, listening to the audio Bible on my phone and going through the Gospel of Matthew. Like I said, it's different than reading it. You're not stopping to look at every detail. It's sort of like getting the overall flow as if you were right there. So I'd like you guys to turn to Matthew chapter 5. Turn to Matthew chapter 5, please. As I was listening to the Sermon on the Mount, I realized that there's a pattern. There's a pattern in the teachings that come up that I would not have noticed if I was just focusing word for word, line by line. At first, it was just an impression that I got. But I think that it reveals a deep principle. It's there. We're going to look at it, but I will admit, I'm not sure I have mastered exactly how to explain it yet, but I know it's very powerful. So let's turn to a few sections of the Sermon on the Mount. I will read the passages that stood out to me, and I'll read them first in a flow, just the way I heard them. But then we'll go back and we'll actually, look at them more carefully. And I want to make the proposition that they share a common element. First of all, I'm just going to ask the web moderator, the Zoom moderator, to make sure that all the video and audio is hooked up, because I'm not seeing things correctly on my end. So if you guys can make sure you take care of that, that would help me and everybody else who's viewing. So Jerry, if you can check on the screen and what's showing, that would help. But in the meanwhile, if you can please turn to Matthew chapter 5. I'm going to read a few passages that, as I said, I believe have a common theme. We'll look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 to 40, then chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, and chapter 6, verses 16 to 18. And again, I just want you to let it roll over you first, and then we'll go back and look at it in greater detail. So here we go. Matthew chapter 5. Imagine you're listening to Jesus on the hillside. He says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic or your cloak, or excuse me, your shirt, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, the beginning of chapter 6, he says a little bit of a different topic, but listen. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you. Now, if we could jump to verse 16. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So like I said, as I was listening to the passage, I think I listened to 4 or 5 chapters all in a flow. There seemed to be a theme that emerged, and I want to use these passages to start working out that theme. So let's start with the chapter 6. There's an obvious pattern in the formula of what Jesus says, but it's not just the structure. I think there's an underlying idea that we look at. These passages, I think, are a little bit easier to swallow at first. So let's go back to chapter 6, verse 1. Notice that Jesus says things that you should do and should not do, and things that you should do. In verse 1, he says, don't practice your righteousness before other people. In other words, don't make a show of how religious you are. Because if you do that, you're not going to have a reward from God. He gives the example in verse 2. When you're giving alms or you're giving to help the needy people, don't make a show. Don't sound the trumpet and show everybody what you're doing. Same thing in verse 5. When you pray, don't pray outside where everybody sees what you're doing. He says instead, go inside your room so that nobody knows. And instead, you're praying directly to the Father for the sake of praying to the Father, not for the sake of getting attention, right? And it's the same thing in verse 16. When you fast, do not look gloomy. People then, like now, feel that fasting is a good spiritual exercise. But Jesus says, don't do it so that people can see what you're doing. As a matter of fact, on the days that you fast, you may feel hungry, but don't let anybody know. Get dressed up, clean, shave, and go outside and look as if it's a regular day. So Jesus here in these sayings is clearly telling us that people should not do religious acts for the sake of being seen. We should do religious acts, Jesus says, for their own sake, for genuine reasons, not mixed with improper motives. We should do things that are religious acts because they're rooted in our relationship with God. So notice that these sayings of Jesus touch on our motives for doing something. In this case, it's religious practices, right? But you could extend it out. What are our motives for doing things? They touch on the intention of ourselves. I could put it this way. What is the motive of the self? Why are we doing things? Are people doing things because they want to be noticed? Is that what they're aiming for? Are they doing things to attract attention? Is their goal to gain status or to gain the praise and accolades of people? If that's the case, then Jesus suggests it is a wrong use of the self. The self should not be tied up with that type of endeavor or that goal or that enterprise, that outcome. In other words, Jesus says here, specifically talking about religious practice, he says religious practice is not about making a show. Making a show is just a way of bolstering the ego, what we call the ego. It's a common word. I think you know what I mean by it. On the contrary, Jesus seems to be saying that when it comes time in our relationship to God, of relating to God, praying and being devoted to God, the ego actually should recede. That means pull back into the background. The ego should get quiet. There's something about our outward persona that should not be seen. Our selves, so to speak, should be submerged into the action and the experience of devotion to God. And like I said, this can apply to other things too. Why are we doing things? Is it for to gain attention for ourselves, or is it for the actual purpose that we're devoting ourselves to? Is that clear so far? That's pretty easy. But now let's turn back to chapter 5. This is where Jesus contrasts what people had been taught and his authoritative issues. That's what we discussed last week. But there's a different theme here. It's similar to what we just read in chapter 6, but it's a little different. So let's go to chapter 5. These verses are even more striking because they suggest something that's very radical. You'll see what I mean. Let's turn back to chapter 5. And you guys can probably see how the light changes on my face, right? When I go back to the Bible on the screen, it's probably more light, right? So chapter 5, starting at verse 38, Jesus says something here. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, Moses had given the people in the ancient world a code of ethics that if somebody hurt you in some way, you shouldn't overdo it, right? You shouldn't retaliate 10 times worse than what they did to you. But if they, knocked out your tooth, then a tooth should be required in return rather than, more than that. So that was what they had heard. But Jesus says, get this, Jesus says this, do not resist the one who is evil. In other words, don't even seek retaliation. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, the typical thing would be to respond, right? In equal force. Jesus says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, guess what? Show them the other side. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. In other words, okay, you're after my goods, here, take both. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Wow. This is why I say this saying is a bit harder. This saying is more striking because they suggest here that followers of Jesus should almost adopt a lack of self-defense, right? Jesus is almost saying that we should give ourselves over to an attitude, totally give ourselves over to an attitude of non-retaliation. Maybe the way I can explain that is by telling what it is not, right? Jesus is telling us that the self, we ourselves inside of us, should not be worried about protecting our rights. We should not be quick to be offended or get affronted by somebody else. Something says somebody offends us, right? Instead, the self should be attached to doing the will of God and carrying out the will of God so that those things just, blow over us. Offenses, accusations, insults. Like I said here, this is radical. It would seem to suggest that we're not supposed to be fighting for our rights because there's something even higher than that to pursue. In the case that Jesus is explaining here in the Sermon on the Mount, what he wants us to pursue is the demonstration or revelation of God's love. I think the Sabbath school ended on that note, if I remember correctly. In other words, Jesus is saying, don't worry so much about yourself. Get caught up in the process. Get caught up in God's work and in his goal. And as he would say later, and all these things will take care of themselves, will be added unto you, right? What I see happening in all of these sayings in chapter 6 and in chapter 5 is that all of these statements touch on what we would call the self or the ego. and they challenge us to ask ourselves the question, what are we attached to? What is our ego attached to? Are we attached to self-defense? Are we attached to gaining attention? Are we attached to looking like big shots, right? Or is there something else that our souls should be attached to, something higher? Like I said, I don't know how you feel when you read these, but these sayings are intense. We might call them radical. We might call them extreme. They convey an attitude to us, these sayings I just read, especially the last. They convey an attitude that's the opposite of actually what comes naturally to us. Rather than resist the demands that are placed on us, Jesus suggests that we go along with them. That even we do it with a smile on our face, right? We do it willingly. Oh, you want me to carry that an extra mile? No problem. Here we go. Jesus is suggesting to us that rather than rise up to defend ourselves, you see, there's that word again, self, right? Self and ego. Rather than rise up to defend ourselves, Jesus says, don't worry, just let the self recede. Let the self be consumed. Let it be brought into the bigger goal of service, even when it's service to your enemies. Now, I'm just elaborating on what Jesus said, because remember what we mentioned. We're going to try to listen to what the master teacher taught us. And I have to admit, these are challenging statements. I'm not sure I even fully understand them, to be honest with you. If I can really grasp them and explain it in the right way. I was fishing around for words that might capture this idea. And I thought maybe humility, but that's not exactly it either, you know? How about emptiness, as if the inside of us is empty? Or another one, ourselves are sort of, I came up with the term given overness. We're given over to something else. We're given over so fully that we're not thinking about ourselves. Another word I thought of is maybe we're invisible. Maybe the self becomes invisible. Or maybe the self is just consumed by a focus on doing God's will so fully that we lose regard for our own advancement. We lose regard for our own protection because we're so absorbed in something else. Now, a common way to describe this in religious circles, I think, is the term selflessness. You've heard that, right? That we should approach or attempt to be selfless. But what does that word mean? What does it mean to be selfless? I heard that term when I first became a Christian a little over 40 years ago, but I think at the time I misunderstood what it meant. As a matter of fact, I don't know if we're going to hang around a little bit after the sermon today, but it might be good for us to discuss. What do we think that word, that term means, right? I'd like to hear how you understand it. Maybe together we can clarify the meaning. But what does the word selfless mean? Does it mean that we're not supposed to have our will anymore? We're supposed to give up our will and never make a decision? Do you think it means that? Does it mean that we're supposed to stamp out our individual identity or personhood? Does it mean that we're not supposed to be persons anymore? Does it, when you hear the word selfless, does it mean that we should give up all our dreams, give up all our interests, and even give up our personality characteristics? I don't think so. In fact, I would have to ask the question, why would God ordain us to have an identity, to have a personality? Why would God create us to have dreams and interests only to command us to crush them out? So I may have thought that this was the meaning of selfless way back at the beginning of my Christian life, but I don't believe that anymore. I don't think that's what selfless means. I think it has more to do with what we just read in chapter 6, that selfless means this: we're still doing things, we're still motivated, we're still excited to contribute, but we're not calling attention to ourselves. You get it? You see the difference? It's like we're still engaged. There's still a part of us that is pursuing what we feel God has for us to do, but we're not calling attention to ourselves. We're not needy. We're not being pushy. We're not like fighting to get our way. As a matter of fact, two terms came to mind when I was trying to sort out this difference between the right way and the wrong way. See what you think. I see a distinction between what we could call the false ego, an ego that's insecure, always seeking attention, always ready to fight for its way. You know, that natural part of us, that false ego, in contrast to what you might call is our true selves. In other words, God made us individuals. He gave us an identity. I'm Stephen. My wife is Maria Elena. We see a number of people here whom I've known for almost 20 years, right? We all have our own personality and identity. God made us that way. We have a true self. But those selves, get this, this is the difference. The true self inside of us is not looking for attention. It's not looking to be bolstered up. The true self is just trying to find out what it is that God has for us to do and then do it. You following me? I know it's different on Zoom than in the church because I can't see your reaction. But this is an interesting topic here. It's an important topic. See, it gives us a picture, this word true self, this whole set of ideas we've been looking at gives us a picture about ourselves. What is the true self? Our true self is finding what God's will is for us, getting excited about doing it, getting submerged in it, getting absorbed into the goal, as if we become transparent, as if we're not even there anymore. It's kind of a paradox. On the one hand, we're fully engaged, but on the other hand, it's like we're not there. We do the work for its own sake. We do what we're called to do for its own sake. We do it for God's sake because we're in relationship with God and He's put it in our hearts to do it. We're still there. You know what I mean? Our consciousness is still there. We're still aware of it. As a matter of fact, we might be enraptured in the experience, but in that process, we don't care about getting attention. We're not clamoring for attention or recognition. It's like I said, it's almost as if we become invisible. Almost, not quite. Again, this is a subtle issue. I'm not sure I'm having success in explaining what I mean yet, because I myself am still like coming to grips with what does that mean when we're selfless? You know, what does that thing mean? These are still impressions that are developing, but it's powerful. It's powerful, which is just what we would expect when we start listening to the teachings of Jesus, right? All right, I want to leave that there for now, but I need to bring in one other thing about Jesus's teaching. For this, please turn to Matthew chapter 20. You remember I said last week that we're not just going to learn from Jesus's teachings, but we're also going to learn from his life. Because as we read in Hebrews, as we read in John and some of the other passages, Jesus is actually the supreme revelation of God. So listen to this. Take a look at Matthew chapter 20. We're going to read verses 25 to 28, and I'm going to turn there. 25 says, Jesus called them meaning the disciples, and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. In other words, the outsiders, the people who are not expected to know God, this is how they act. The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, means they dominate the people who are under them, right? And their great ones exercise authority over them meaning the populace. So that's the way they do it, Jesus says. But in verse 26, he says, it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. You see the principle there. It's the principle we've been talking about. The true self, the self that's in touch with God, the self that's living for God, doing God's will, is not interested in puffing itself up or making itself higher, and certainly not interested in dominating over other people. That's not what Jesus says. Whoever would be great among you would be your servant. And in verse 27, and whoever would be first among you would be your slave, must be your slave. But here's the kicker, here's the clincher. Verse 28, just as, or even as, or in the same way as the Son of Man came. This he's talking about himself now. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see what I'm saying here? The true followers of Jesus are not out for power. They're not looking for prestige. They're not looking for control. The true followers of Jesus are there to serve. Like I said before, they recede into the background. The false ego compresses down, like just deflates. And the true self finds fulfillment in the process itself. The true self finds fulfillment in the work without asking for any accolades or acclamation, right? The true self finds fulfillment in the service. And remember the context of that story we just read. That's when the mother of James and John had come and asked for her children to be the ones that sit on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus. You remember how the story is? Jesus saying, no, you guys, you've got it backwards. You've got it upside down. That's the false ego. The true self doesn't care about that. The true self only is interested in doing the right thing. But the second point that I mentioned a minute ago is also vital. Notice that this is how Jesus himself operates. He didn't come down here for power. He didn't come down for privilege or even recognition necessarily, although we need to recognize him and embrace him. Jesus came down to do the work of a servant, to do God's will. In other words, he was that selfless, invisible person that just came down here to get the job done. We would say the work or the mission. And guess what? Here's the really important thing. That's how God is. We believe that Jesus is the third person of the Godhead in the flesh. So what we see in Jesus, we know that's the character of God. This is how God is, invisible, just interested in doing the thing. Let that sink in. So in other words, the theme we've been looking at today is not just a novel way for us to live. It's not just this unusual way that Jesus told us to live. No, this is also a revolutionary way to understand God. Well, let me say that in reverse. This is not just a better way to understand the character of God, which it is. This is also the way to live. Not caught up in the self, not caught up in the false ego, but transparent. And therefore, get this, if we're transparent, therefore we're unassailable. Nothing can bother us. We have no reason to be disturbed because there's no false ego there to defend. We're absorbed into the endeavor itself. I imagine somebody like a concert pianist. Imagine a concert pianist in Carnegie Hall or in Lincoln Center. They've trained and they've practiced all these years, and now they're giving the recital. Do you think they're thinking about themselves? Do you think they're even able to think about themselves, or are they fully focused on the music? Not only fully focused on it, but fully absorbed in it, right? Or how about a brain surgeon? You think a brain surgeon in the middle of the intricate surgery is thinking about how he looks to the outside world? Or does brain surgery require absolute concentration and absorption? You can't be thinking about yourself. The ego vanishes at that point. The person who's doing the work is not obliterated. You know, it's not like the self is crushed out as if you're a non-entity. No, as a matter of fact, the self is so caught up in the process that it almost becomes like an ecstasy. That kind of self is impervious to insults and offenses because the false ego is gone. The false striving is gone. The striving for power, the striving to get our way, the striving to prove that we are right, it's gone. The true self, though, is still there. The true self that's absorbed into God, absorbed into God's will, and absorbed into the higher purpose. Now, with that, we finally come to the scripture reading. One more verse for you. If you turn to Matthew chapter 11, we'll come back to the scripture reading. We'll conclude with the last idea of my message for today. Matthew chapter 11. Shannon read this nicely before. The very end of the chapter, it touches on what I've just been saying. Chapter 11, verse 28 says, Jesus says to us, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And what's his yoke? His yoke is what we've been talking about this whole time. It's not looking to be big. It's not looking to be important. It's not striving for attention, not trying to be supreme. His yoke, he says, is meek and lowly. It's when the false ego just vanishes and recedes into the background and the true self merges with God's will. He says in that experience is rest. There's no more false ego to defend. Like Jesus, we can be wholly given over to the cause. And that's the point. That's the teaching. That's the way. As a matter of fact, when I was preparing this, I thought of a tune, a pop song that I heard when I was a young person. It's more than 50 years old, and there has a line in it that I never really understood when I was young, and I haven't thought about it lately. Some of you will know this tune by the Bee Gees. It starts off like this. I started a joke that started the whole world crying. Oh, if I had only seen that the joke was on me. So he's talking about, I think, the projection of his ego out into the world, right? But the clincher, the line that I never understood until I grew old was this one. I finally died, which started the whole world living. That's the idea here. That's what Jesus is saying. When you let that false ego down, when you finally let that die, then life comes. Take my yoke upon you, he said, and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So we've come to the scripture reading. Now let me explain the sermon title, and we'll end here. I titled the sermon, Knock, Knock, Who's There? We've all heard that expression before. It's usually like a pun, right? No, but what I meant it was this. When someone knocks at the door of our hearts, who will they find inside, or what will they find inside? Will they find the true self, or will they find the false ego? Will they find that striving, straining, needy ego that's insecure, that's clamoring for recognition and clamoring for power? Or will, when they knock, will they see that peaceful, smiling self that's absorbed into God's love and blessing and ready to do what needs to be done? Knock, knock, who's there? You remember there's one image in the Bible, and I don't even need to tell you where it is. It's in Revelation chapter 3, where we see Jesus knocking, and he says, I stand at the door and knock. If any man will open the door, I will come in unto him and sup with him and he with me, right? There's this idea that Jesus's life, Jesus is out there. He's asking to let his life in, to share and mingle with us, so that what's inside of us is Jesus's spirit. And here's what I'm going to end with. If we have the spirit of Jesus in us, then this attitude I've been describing to this morning and this afternoon, if we have the spirit of Jesus in us, then that attitude will be in us. The true expression of the self will be in us. We won't be chasing after our own power or glory, but we'll be immersed in the good and in the right. And I think the same thing is true. If we have this attitude in us, then in essence, we have the life of God in us. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen for that, Pastor.